Hallo Deutschlerner! A few weeks ago I explained the differences between Konjunktiv 1 and Konjunktiv 2 in German. I did this in the most generic way possible and kept the details to a minimum. In this video I'm going to go much deeper into the Konjunktiv 1, including when and why you should need to use it, and how to form it, which tenses you can use with it, and a whole lot more. So grab your notebook and your pen and let's get started. As I mentioned in the other video, the Konjunktiv 1 is used when relaying information that is said by someone else. This is known as indirect speech. In everyday speech, however, most Germans would not use the Konjunktiv 1 to report what was said by one of their friends. They would just use the indicative, which is what you're used to seeing in German. If you are below A2, there is pretty much no reason for you to know how to recognize or even use the Konjunktiv 1. If you are above that, it might show up on a proficiency exam, but even then, you're probably only going to need to understand what is said and not necessarily how to build it yourself. Konjunktiv 1 is most commonly used to report the news, like in a newspaper or a newscast. For example, Und nun zu einer erstaunlichen Geschichte. Unsere Reporter vor Ort berichtet, dass eine Gruppe von Katzen beschlossen habe, eine eigene Rockband zu gründen. Die Katzen, so heißt es, nennen sich The Meowsters und spielen angeblich auf winzigen Gitarren und Schlagzeugen. Es wird gesagt, dass ihre erste Single Perfect Beat schon nächste Woche erscheinen werde. Ein Augenzeuge behauptet, dass die Katzen sogar in der Lage seien, synchron zu miauen und zu tanzen. Ob dies wirklich stimmt, bleibt abzuwarten. Bleiben Sie dran für weitere Updates von dieser unglaublichen Geschichte. Konjunktiv 1 also gives a bit of distance between the person or group reporting the information and the source of that information. Mein Bruder sagt, sei in der Schule, aber seine Snapchat-Story zeigt eine andere Geschichte. My brother says he's in school, but his Snapchat story shows another story. When it comes to forming the Konjunktiv 1, there are 4 tenses to worry about. The Gegenwart, present, Vergangenheit, past, Zukunft, future, and Futur 2, or future perfect. For simplicity's sake, let's just start with the present. With the exception of sein and the modal verbs, the verb forms in the present tense Konjunktiv 1 can be summed up as normal present tense but with extra ease. For example, machen, to do or make. Ich mache. Du machest. Sie, es mache. Wir machen. Ihr machet. Sie machen. Notice that the ich, wir, and sie plural and sie formal forms are identical to the normal forms that you are used to seeing. It is for this reason that you either avoid using these forms altogether or use the Konjunktiv 2 instead of these forms. Let's look at the verb geben as another example. Ich gebe. Du gebest. Sie, es gebe. Wir geben. Ihr gebet. Sie geben. Notice that we also lost the stem change that usually happens here, so instead of saying du gibst, we now say du gebest, and instead of saying sie es gibt, we now say sie es gebe. Because the 2 z's at the bottom of the conjugation chart use the same conjugation forms as they usually do, whenever you're saying this in the Konjunktiv 1, lots of people would actually just use the Konjunktiv 2 to say the exact same thing. Because if you said it in Konjunktiv 1, it would be Sie behaupten, sie geben dir morgen das Geld, which sounds like the indicative mood, which sounds normal and nothing out of the ordinary here. So we're not separating ourselves from the people about whom we are reporting. In order to actually do that, we would use the Konjunktiv 2. Sie behaupten, sie geben dir morgen das Geld. They claim they are giving you the money tomorrow. As you can see from the examples using machen and geben, the general rule for creating the present tense versions of Konjunktiv 1 is to use the ich form of the verb for the sie form, meaning there is an e at the end instead of a t. The do and ihr forms add an extra e between the st and t, respectively, and all of the other forms stay exactly the same as they would have been in the normal present tense. I mentioned earlier that there is one exception to the present tense conjugation rules, and that is, of course, the verb sein. Here are its forms. Sein, to be. Ich sei. Du seist. Sie, es sei. Wir seien. Ihr seiet. Sie seien. Der Mann sagt, sei nicht zu Hause, aber seine Stimme kommt aus dem Haus. The man says he is not at home, but his voice is coming from inside the house. When you use a modal verb in the Konjunktiv 1 in the present tense, you need to memorize their conjugations. Basically, they're conjugated like you were a German 1 student and you had no idea how irregular these verbs actually are. Ich and RZS get an E at the end. Du and ihr get an extra E before you add ST or T. Wir and Sie, both the plural one and the formal U, get the same forms as they usually do, which is pretty much the same as the infinitives. Dürfen, may, to be allowed to. Ich dürfe, du dürfest. Sie, es, dürfe. Wir dürfen, ihr dürfet, Sie dürfen. Können, ich könne, du könnest, sie, es könne. Wir können, ihr könnet, Sie können. Mögen, to like. Ich möge, du mögest, sie, es möge. Wir mögen, ihr möget, Sie mögen. Müssen, must, or to have to. Ich müsse, du müssest, sie, es müsse. Wir müssen, ihr müsset, Sie müssen. Sollen, should, or to be supposed to. Ich solle, du sollest, sie, es solle. Wir sollen, ihr sollet, Sie sollen. Wollen, to want. Ich wolle, du wollest, sie, es wolle. Wir wollen, ihr wollet, Sie wollen. Don't forget that möchten is not really a modal verb. It's technically the Konjunktiv 2 version of mögen, which is why it is not listed here. When you move to the past tense in the Konjunktiv 1, we use a modified version of the perfect tense. This means we conjugate either haben or sein, and then we put a past participle at the end of the sentence for the main verb. For example, mein Bruder behauptet, habe einen neuen Mercedes gekauft. My brother claims he bought a new Mercedes. Meine Mutter hat in seine Garage geschaut und das Auto sei nicht da. My mother looked into his garage and the car was not there. I've already shown you the full conjugation of sein. Here is the Konjunktiv 1 version of haben. Ich habe. Du habest. Sie, es habe. Wir haben. Ihr habet. Sie haben. If you need a refresher course about the perfect tense, my playlist of videos about that tense are linked in the description. When you need to express something in the future using the Konjunktiv 1, you have two options. You can use the regular future tense Futur 1 with the verb werden conjugated in the Konjunktiv 1 forms, or you can use the Futur 2 version, which includes a past participle at the end of the sentence. In case you don't remember, the Futur 1 is simply expressing that the action is likely to occur after the current moment, i.e. in the future. The Futur 2, by contrast, shows that something has already been completed at the time of reference in the future. Before we get into the examples, we need to learn how to conjugate werden in the Konjunktiv 1 first. Werden, will. Ich werde. Du werdest. Sie, es werde. Wir werden. Ihr werdet. Sie werden. You'll notice that the only forms that are really different here are the du and RZS forms. This again means that you would probably actually use the Konjunktiv 2 to express the other forms in indirect speech. Let's try some examples. Mein Nachbar hat mir erzählt, dass sein Hund eine Adoptionsagentur gründen werde. My neighbor told me that his dog is going to start an adoption agency. Bis 2035 werde die Adoptionsagentur 5000 Hunde gerettet haben. By 2035, the adoption agency will have saved 5,000 dogs. In the first example, I use the regular future tense to talk about something generic in the future, namely the starting of an adoption agency. The second example used the Futur 2 to illustrate that the act of rescuing 5,000 dogs will have been completed at the point of reference in 2035. If you need a refresher course on either the Futur 1 or Futur 2, you can find videos for those linked in the description as well. So to recap, the Konjunktiv 1 is used to express indirect speech. You do this by pretending that the irregular verbs don't exist and adding e's where they usually wouldn't be. You can use the Konjunktiv 1 to express things about the present, future, and past, including the future perfect tense. If the Konjunktiv 1 is not really recognizable because the Konjunktiv 1 version is the same as the normal conjugation of the verb, you can use the Konjunktiv 2 instead, but it should be clear that you are using this as indirect speech based on the structures that you use. For more about the Konjunktiv 1 and 2, check out my playlist full of lessons about them over here. Das ist alles für heute. Danke fürs Zuschauen. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss!